Mom should move out. The baby and I need quiet. She's too much. I heard my daughter-in-law, Brielle, loud and clear from the living room, right as my hand was spreading butter on a slice of bread. The knife froze in midair. My son, Terence, only nodded softly, his hand rubbing his wife's shoulder, as if he were soothing a child to sleep. A few minutes later, he walked into the kitchen, holding a stack of brochures for luxury senior apartment complexes. On the very first page, my name was written clearly in blue ink, Viola Randall. I looked around the kitchen that had once been the heart of this home. New beige curtains, shiny white bowls and plates replacing the cobalt blue set I had used for 30 years. The family photo frames? Gone. In their place were minimalist wall art pieces. Beautiful, yes, but soulless, without memory. I pressed my lips together, set the teaspoon down gently, then nodded at my son. "I'll think about it, sweetheart." But that night, I stepped into Samuel's study, my late husband's room, opened the safe, and took out all the ownership documents of this house. On them, there was only one name, Viola Randall. And from that very moment, I began building a trap they would walk straight into, without the slightest idea. If you're still listening, tell me where you're tuning in from. Every comment you leave is a marker on this journey. And if this story touches you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach more people. Because from here on, everything is only just beginning. In the next part, I'll tell you every step I quietly observed, recorded, and prepared for the day this house would speak on my behalf. Stay with me. My name is Viola Randall, 68 years old, a widow for 8 years, living in a 2-story white wooden house by Clear Lake, on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. Samuel, my husband, and I spent nearly 40 years building this place with our own hands. He used to work as a welder at the shipyard, then later became a petroleum technician. Every brick, every plank of flooring, every window frame facing the water, each carried the sweat, the laughter, and the dreams of a husband and wife. But now, this house barely holds any trace of me anymore. Ever since Brielle, my daughter-in-law, moved in, everything began to change in a cold, quiet, and undeniable way. At first, it was just gentle suggestions. "Mom, let me replace these curtains to brighten things up. Beige fits a modern style better." I nodded. No suspicion. They were just curtains, after all. Then the cobalt blue ceramic dish set I had used for 30 years, the one Samuel bought me from an old market in New Orleans, disappeared. In its place came spotless white porcelain dishes, matching and pristine. "To keep the style consistent, Mom," Brielle explained, her voice sweet as honey. The family photos, the wedding photo of Samuel and me, his portrait in his technician uniform, Terence's college graduation picture, gradually vanished from the walls. "I'm putting them away temporarily so they don't gather dust, Mom." But all those little temporary things added up into a cold emptiness inside the very home I had built. My son Terence, 34 years old, works as a maintenance engineer for a petroleum company in the suburbs. He's gentle, hates conflict. Perhaps that's why, when his wife said she needed quiet for the baby, all he could do was nod. "Mom, Brielle is pregnant, and the doctor says stress isn't good for the baby. Maybe you should find a more comfortable place, like near the Clear Lake senior living area. The view is beautiful." His voice was gentle, as if he were suggesting a change to the dinner menu, but every word cut into me like a knife. I looked straight into his eyes exactly like Samuel's, and smiled. "I understand, sweetheart." I'm not the type to explode. I spent my whole life working as an ER nurse at Houston Methodist Clear Lake Hospital, where screaming and blood were daily occurrences. I know that blowing up only weakens you. What matters is observing, remembering, and acting at the right moment. So that night, after they went to bed, I sat in Samuel's study and opened the safe. Inside were the house ownership documents, with only my name on them, property insurance papers, tax records, and the updated will I had prepared after Samuel passed. I laid everything out on the table, each document neatly aligned. On every page, the red stamp read, Owner, Viola E. Randall. I smiled. A thin smile, not joyful, but startlingly clear. If at this point you're beginning to sense something is wrong, ask yourself, in your own home, have you ever felt like a temporary guest? If the answer is yes, stay with me, because what you're about to hear next may feel familiar enough to chill you. The next morning, I made coffee like usual. The aroma of freshly roasted beans drifted through the house, a scent reminding me that I still had control. I added a pinch of cinnamon, Samuel's old habit, then sat at the kitchen table. Brielle walked in, hand on her belly, her voice gentle. Good morning, Mom. Did you look at those brochures last night? I sipped my coffee, the bitterness spreading across my tongue. Yes, I'll consider it. I kept that same smile. Brielle didn't know that I had installed an automatic recording app on my phone, capturing every conversation in the house. I started keeping a logbook of events. Every nurse knows how important that is. Whenever something was moved or a passing comment seemed strange, I wrote it down. Date, time, who said it, whom they said it to, and what was said. Under each line, I put a star if something felt off. March 12th. Brielle changed the curtains. Reason. Brighter for the baby. March 15th. Wedding photo vanished from wall. Reason. To avoid dust. 3:20. Terrence slept on the couch. Reason. Brielle needs quiet. Every night I looked at that notebook like I was gathering evidence for a case whose patient didn't know they were sick. The house began to feel foreign to me. Each morning, Brielle played soft music, calling it therapy for the baby. She drifted through the living room in a silk robe, hand always on her belly like the lead actress in a motherhood film, and I, the actual mother of this home, was pushed into a silent supporting role. I heard her on the phone with a friend. I love my mother-in-law, but she stresses the baby out. We need to send her somewhere else so she can rest. Her voice sweet as honey, but underneath it was the smell of cold metal. I still went grocery shopping, cooked, tended the garden. But everything I did slowly became a thorn in her side. One morning, I was on the phone with my sister in Chicago when Brielle came downstairs, annoyance on her face. Mom, what time did you make that call? Around 10. That's during my morning nap. Pregnant women need rest in the morning. Your voice is a bit loud. I looked at her and simply said, I'll remember. In my mind, I marked a red star in the logbook. I added a video doorbell camera with recording capability. Brielle thought I was worried about safety, but the truth was, I wanted to know who came and went when Terrence wasn't home. I also placed a small recorder inside the living room cabinet. Everything I did was slow, careful, like playing chess. No need to win now, only make sure that when it was my turn, the opponent had no escape. On the third night after the breakfast suggestion to move out, Terrence said he would sleep at the office for convenience. I knew he was following his wife's plan so she could rest. I heard the car door shut. Then the house fell into silence. Upstairs, Brielle turned on the light in my bedroom, the room Samuel and I had used, and walked through it, measuring, taking notes. I stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up, saying nothing. There are things you understand just by watching. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat by the window overlooking Clear Lake. The water rippled under the moon, quiet in a way that felt suspicious. I missed Samuel, the way he would say, You know, Viola, victory doesn't come from shouting. It comes from the silence that unnerves people. I set my glass down, opened my laptop, and sent an email to attorney Howard Langford, the man who handled my paperwork after Samuel passed. Hello, Mr. Langford. I need to re-verify my property ownership. Need an in-person meeting. Is Monday morning okay? The reply came faster than I expected. Of course, Ms. Randall. Bring the originals. I'll review them. I closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, listening to the wind brushing through the oak trees on the porch. In the dark, I wasn't afraid. I had never felt more clear-headed. The next morning before sunrise, I woke early, made coffee, and prepared a few cinnamon waffles, an old habit I'd never abandoned. Brielle came into the kitchen, surprised to see I had already eaten. "Where are you going so early, Mom?" she asked, voice still sweet. "Just to the bank," I said, picking up my handbag. "The bank? Are you withdrawing money?" "I just want to review a few old things, like the house papers." She froze for half a second, but I pretended not to notice. Driving to the lawyer's office, the early spring wind was icy, yet inside I felt warm. Warm because I knew I wasn't powerless anymore. Warm because no matter how hard they tried to erase me from this home, there was one thing they could never erase: my signature on the property deed. I stopped by a cafe near Clear Lake, took out my notebook, and wrote another line. March 22nd. They think I will leave, but I am returning, one step at a time. I sipped my coffee, watching the morning light spread across the water. The breeze carried the scent of pines and the chirping of sparrows. I understood that this fight wasn't about the house. It was about the right to exist in your own life. When I left the cafe, my phone vibrated. A message from Attorney Langford. "Confirmed. You are the sole owner. No co-ownership, no liens." I smiled as the wind pushed my silver hair back. "Well then, let's begin," I whispered. If my daughter-in-law wanted quiet for the baby, I would give her the quiet she wanted. After the storm I was preparing swept through this house. 2 days after meeting with the lawyer, I came home with a strange sense of calm. I thought things would stay quiet for a while longer, but it turned out that silence only existed so Brielle could prepare for her next act. That morning, she was standing in the kitchen with a pale green smoothie, speaking in a steady, clear tone, like she'd practiced in front of a mirror for a long time. "The doctor says this stage is when it's most important to avoid stress noise, arguments, emotional shocks. Any of that can affect the baby." I had just come in from the garden, dirt still on my hands. "Are you talking to me?" I asked, gently. Brielle turned around and gave me a polite smile. "I'm not blaming you, Mom. It's just, sometimes when you're on the phone or walking around early, I get startled awake. My body needs rest in the mornings. The doctor really emphasized that." I wiped my hands on a towel and looked at her. 30 years in the emergency room, I'd heard every excuse, every way of saying things, but I had never encountered any medical concept called "the fetus gets stressed because the mother-in-law talks at 10 in the morning." What Brielle was saying wasn't medical advice. It was a script she'd memorized. So I simply smiled. "I'll try to walk more softly and talk more quietly." Brielle nodded, looking very pleased. She thought I had just stepped neatly into the supporting role she'd written for me. That night, Terrence came home late. I sat on the porch, listening to the car pull in and his heavy footsteps on the brick path. He looked exhausted, his shoulders sagging, as if he'd aged a few extra years on the way home. I poured him some tea and asked softly, "Have you eaten dinner yet?" He shook his head. "Brielle's been tired all day. I grabbed some takeout." I nodded and waited. Sure enough, a few seconds later, he looked at me, hesitating. "Mom, I know things are a little tense, but please try to understand Brielle. She's trying to take care of her health. The doctor said stress can cause contractions." I set my cup down slowly and said nothing. I just quietly recorded each word in my head. That night, when everyone was asleep, I opened my leather notebook and wrote, "Terrence, 9:10 p.m. Please understand Brielle. The doctor said stress can cause contractions." I added a note, voice calm, avoiding eye contact, repeating his wife's words. The next day, while I was sweeping the porch, Mrs. Yvette Coleman, the neighbor across the street, walked by and stopped to say hello. "Viola, I heard your daughter-in-law is having some difficulties with the pregnancy. Poor thing, you must be so worried." I looked up. "Who told you that?" Mrs. Yvette smiled politely. "Oh, just neighborhood chatter. She said she's been feeling tired because there are too many people in the house. You know how sensitive pregnant women are." I didn't respond right away. I just gave a faint smile. But inside, I went ice cold. Brielle had started spinning her own story, a story woven out of sympathy and cunning, and her first audience was the neighbors. That afternoon, while Terrence was at work, I tried a different tactic. I walked into the living room where Brielle was knitting and said calmly, "If you need things quieter, I can adjust my schedule. I'll make calls in my room, won't turn on the TV in the mornings. I can even go out in the garden so you can rest. Would that help?" Brielle looked up and gave me a thin smile. "You're so thoughtful, Mom, but in the long run, I think you should have a space of your own. Not for me, for you. You deserve to relax without worrying about anything." Her voice was still sweet as honey. But that sentence was an eviction notice wrapped in gift paper, I understood. The quiet she wanted wasn't peace. It was my absence. That night, I sat alone and took inventory in my head. I realized there were things that had gone missing that I hadn't noticed at first. The cedar chest, where I kept Samuel's clothes and our old letters, was no longer at the foot of my bed. The cobalt blue ceramic set I bought in New Orleans 10 years ago, my pride and joy, was no longer on the shelf. The anniversary quilt Samuel gave me for our 30th? Temporarily stored in the basement, Brielle had said. I went down to the basement to check cold, dark, damp. Among the cardboard boxes labeled in black marker, I saw one that said, "Mom's Kitchen Stuff." I opened the lid. Inside were my dishes, wrapped in old newspaper, dust-coated like evidence of a very intentional kind of forgetting. I closed the lid and exhaled slowly. I knew that if I reacted, she'd have one more piece of proof that I was easily agitated. So I chose silence, but my silence did not mean surrender. If at this point things are starting to feel familiar, those for the child, for the future, for their health lines being used as excuses to push an older person to the margins, ask yourself this. In that story, who are you? The one being pushed out, or the one standing by and staying silent? Keep your answer in your heart, because when things escalate later, you may find yourself looking at all those for the baby justifications in a very different light. From that moment on, I realized Brielle had her own language of manipulation. Everything she said started with 3 words. For the baby. For the baby, don't run the washing machine in the morning. For the baby, don't cook foods with strong smells. For the future, you should rest, Mom. For the sake of the baby's health, you should go out more. Each sentence was light as a thread, but together they tightened into a rope. She never gave direct orders, but she made you feel guilty if you didn't comply. I could feel myself being slowly rewritten into the villain of her story, the selfish mother-in-law who refused to make room for the new generation. I didn't argue. I started acting. That night, I opened a small box in my desk drawer and took out the mini voice recorder I used to use as a nurse to record shift notes. I brushed off the dust, put in fresh batteries, and placed it under the bookshelf in the living room, where Brielle usually sat to make calls. It was small enough that no one would notice, but the mic was very sensitive. I also changed the lock on the cabinet where I kept the house deeds, insurance papers, and savings books I didn't want to wake up one day to hear, "I just put it away for you so it wouldn't clutter the place, Mom." A few days later, while I was watering plants on the porch, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was a screenshot of a group chat named Mommy and Friends. Brielle's message stood out on the screen. "By the end of this month, I'll clear out my mother-in-law's room to make it the nursery. We'll repaint it cream so it's less gloomy." Below it, a friend had replied, "Love that. I wish my MIL would move out that soon." I stared at the screen, feeling my hand tremble slightly. Not from anger, but from contempt. I saved the screenshot into a folder called Evidence 2, then copied it to an external drive. Every file, every line of text was another link in the chain I didn't need to explode. I just needed to be thorough. That afternoon, I heard Brielle laughing in the living room, her voice high and cheerful. "Of course I'm tired. She always thinks she's right. But I'm about to have a beautiful room. Just wait." Her friend's voice came faintly through the phone, mingling with music. "That's how it should be. Pregnant women should always be the priority. Brielle lowered her voice. Terrence won't object. He just wants a peaceful life. I stood behind the kitchen door, hearing every word I wanted to laugh, a laugh with no joy in it. Terrence wasn't objecting, that was true, but not objecting doesn't mean agreeing. Some people choose silence to avoid conflict, and that silence slowly kills them. I went back to the table, opened my notebook, and wrote the last line of the day, March 29th. Brielle confirms she'll clear my room to make it the nursery voice, confident, not afraid. That confidence was her first weakness. I closed the notebook, laid the pen on the cover, and let my eyes drift to the small photo of Samuel on the shelf. See that? I whispered. They think I've gotten weak, but you know, Viola Randall has never been weak. I turned off the lights and let the house sink into quiet darkness. Somewhere upstairs, Brielle was still murmuring along to a prenatal meditation track, her voice steady like a lullaby of deception. I lay back and listened to the wind slipping through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of young pine and the faint sound of waves on the lake. I knew I was going to sleep well that night. The longer this went on, the more certain I became that the game had only just begun. And I, the one they called the source of stress, was exactly the kind of stillness they would soon have to face, along with all of their fears. That morning, I had just finished watering the pots of carnations on the porch when I heard the sound of high heels echoing inside the house. Not my heels. Brielle's, the woman who now walked around this home as if she owned it. When I stepped in, she was sitting at the dining table, in front of her a stack of glossy papers and a bright smile. A bit too bright. "Oh, there you are, Mom," she said cheerfully. "I just found this. I thought you'd like it." On the table was a cream-colored brochure printed with the words, Clear Lake Senior Living, where a new chapter begins in peace. I recognized this type of design right away. Clean layout, easy-to-read fonts, images of smiling elderly people in flower gardens, in yoga rooms, in sunny breakfast halls, the kind of happy advertising designed to convince older folks that they're choosing freedom for themselves rather than being neatly placed on the sidelines by someone else. Brielle flipped through each page, her pale pink nails gliding over the paper. "Look here, Mom, bright rooms, big windows facing the garden. They have shuttles, meal plans, and a dance club on Fridays. You'll make so many new friends." I leaned down to look more closely. A small studio room with a single window, pale red brick walls. In the photo, an elderly woman with silver hair reading a book beside a plastic flower vase. In the corner, a red pen circle around that image with the handwritten note, perfect for her. "You did a lot of research, huh?" I asked, my voice calm. Brielle gave a soft smile. "Yes, I did the homework so you wouldn't have to. Clear Lake Senior Living is only 20 minutes drive from here, and they have their own shuttle to take you to the store and doctor's appointments. Super convenient, Mom." At the bottom corner of the brochure, I caught a glimpse of a small line of text. Executive Director, Colin Mercer. At the time, that name just passed by like a minor administrative detail. I didn't yet know it would be the first trace leading to an entirely different story. Right then, Terrence walked in, tie still loose, phone in his hand. He put the phone down and glanced at the brochure. "You should check it out, Mom," he said. "It's really nice there. You wouldn't have to garden or fix leaky pipes anymore. The staff takes care of everything. You just relax." I rested my hand on the back of the chair and looked straight at the two of them. For a moment, the room was so quiet, it felt like even the air had stopped moving. I asked slowly, one word at a time, "Did you both forget whose name is on the deed to this house?" They both froze immediately. Terrence's eyes flicked over to Brielle, as if waiting for her signal. Brielle blinked once, then let out a light, nervous little laugh, the kind of laugh people use to fake confusion. "Oh, Mom, of course no one forgot. I just thought maybe you'd be more comfortable there. I'm only thinking about the baby." I smiled. "That's right. because of the baby. I pulled out a chair, sat down, lifted my coffee cup, and blew gently. This place does look peaceful. Exactly, Brielle said, sounding relieved, as if she believed I had started to soften. If you agree, I can arrange a tour with the manager. Clear Lake Senior Living is running a special if you move in before the end of the month. First month free. I set my coffee cup down and slid the brochure back toward her. Interesting, but I think I need to think carefully. After all, they say if you want to move out, you should first make sure you actually own the place you're living in. Brielle's smile faltered, stiffening a little. Terrence hurried to jump in, forcing a smile. We just want to help you, Mom. There's nothing else behind it. Of course, I replied, my tone even, my gaze steady. I believe that. I stood up and carried my coffee cup to the sink. No one said another word. I heard very clearly the soft exhale from Brielle, as if she had just escaped a dangerous situation she didn't even fully realize was a cliff's edge. If you've ever been in my position, treated like a piece of furniture that can be rearranged for convenience, you'll understand how that feeling chills you straight to the bone. But often, those moments when you feel you're being cornered are exactly when you quietly turn around and lay the first brick of your counterattack. Keep that thought in mind, because what Brielle thought of as a special move-in offer before the end of the month was nothing more than a very gentle opening act for the storm that was coming. That evening, after the two of them had gone upstairs, I sat in the study and opened my laptop. The cream brochure was still there on the desk lamp shining on the words, "A place to belong. A place to belong." I had belonged to this house for 40 years. There was no reason to trade it for a room of maybe 300 square feet just because someone thought it was more convenient. I opened the safe, took out all the house documents, and laid them on the desk. Deed, title insurance, property tax records, homeowner's insurance policy. I checked each page, each line. Everything was intact. No co-owner, no lien, no transfer. No one had any right to touch it but me. I scanned everything and saved it into a separate folder on my computer, password protected. Then I emailed all of it to myself with the subject line, "Private, for my eyes only. Done." I opened my messages and typed to attorney Howard Langford. "Mr. Langford, please reconfirm my sole ownership of the Lakewood property. No co-ownership, no liens, no transfers. I need confirmation as soon as possible." Just 10 minutes later, his reply arrived. "Checked. The house is in your name only. Completely clean. I'll send a notarized copy tomorrow morning." I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a wave of relief rise up. Not just because of the house, but because I knew there was at least one thing no one could pretend to rearrange for convenience. The only legacy Samuel left me. That night, I printed out a copy, slipped it into a flat envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the front, "Legal property of Viola Randall." I didn't use it right away. I only needed it ready for the performance, at the right time, in the right place. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the beige curtains, the ones Brielle had replaced just last week. I took my first sip of coffee and listened to her moving around in the kitchen. She had already begun acting as if this house were her own, opening cabinets, rearranging dishes, clearing out the lower drawers, pulling chairs, shifting furniture. "Mom, I'm just tidying up a bit," she said sweetly. "So when the baby comes home, we'll have a clean, open space." I nodded, smiling. "Go ahead, just don't touch the cabinet in my study." "Of course," she replied, eyes still glued to the drawer, not even bothering to look at me. At noon, I heard her on the phone in the hallway. "Yes, I think once my mother-in-law moves out, we can repaint the living room cream. I'll send you the new design tonight." Her voice was low, but I heard the words, "moves out," very clearly. She walked past me in the kitchen, face bright, as if that conversation had never happened. "Mom, I'm making salad. Do you want some?" "Sure," I said, sitting down. "You seem busy." "Oh, just a few little things," she laughed, "getting ready before the baby comes. When she turned to grab a knife, I spotted the Clear Lake Senior Living brochure shoved into the kitchen drawer, its edges creased, the clear sign she had flipped through it more than once. That afternoon when Terrence came home, I was reading on the porch. He sat down next to me, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Mom, I know what I said yesterday was a bit clumsy. Brielle only wants what's best." "Best for whom?" I asked, my eyes still on the newspaper. He stayed quiet for a few seconds. "For all of us." I folded the newspaper and kept my gaze fixed on the lake. "Son, sometimes people say for all of us, but what they really mean is for themselves. I've seen that more times than you'd think." Terrence let out a light sigh. "I just don't want you and Brielle to misunderstand each other." "Misunderstand?" I almost laughed. "There's no misunderstanding here, Terrence. I hear everything clearly." I placed my hand on his shoulder and patted it gently. "Don't worry, I'm not going to argue. I just want to remind you of one thing. I know very well whose name is on this house, and I also know when it's time to remind other people of that." He looked at me, confused, then nodded slightly. "I understand." That night, as the lights in the house went out one by one, I was still awake. I stood by the window, looking down at the garden Samuel and I had tended for 40 years. The tulips were budding, fresh green grass pushing through the damp soil. I remembered Samuel once saying, "Don't let anyone plant in your garden before you know what they plan to harvest." I smiled and pulled the curtains closed. Downstairs, the living room light was still on. Brielle was still tidying up, or rather, running a full rehearsal. I heard the clinking of china, the steady footsteps moving through each room. She was practicing her role, the role of the new mistress of the house. I went to bed, turned off the light, and thought to myself, "Go on, Brielle. The more deeply you sink into your character, the harder the fall will be when the curtain finally comes down." That afternoon, I was trimming the lavender bushes along the fence when I saw Mrs. Yvette Coleman, the neighbor on my right, walking over. She's about 5 feet tall, lightly curled hair, and always carrying the faint scent of soft roses. She handed me a bag of freshly picked apples, her voice trying to sound like casual gossip. "Viola, I don't want to meddle in anyone's private business, but yesterday I stopped by the Bayshore Inn, the hotel across from the gas station, and I saw Brielle with a man." My hand holding the shears froze in midair. "What man?" I asked, my voice steady. Mrs. Yvette lowered her voice slightly. "I don't know his name, but he was wearing a dark suit, driving a black Lexus, confident posture. About 40, I recognized Brielle from her hair and that cream-colored coat she always wears. They didn't look around, just walked straight into the hotel, holding hands. I even called her name, but she acted like she didn't hear." I smiled, accepted the bag of apples, and kept my expression calm. "Perhaps you were mistaken," I said softly. But inside, I felt it clearly. The puzzle pieces were beginning to shift. That evening, I sat at my desk, opened my leather notebook, and wrote 4/2. Mrs. Yvette Coleman said she saw Brielle with an unfamiliar man at the Bayshore Inn. Description: dark suit, silver watch, black Lexus, not Terrence. I read the line "not Terrence" several times. There are things you don't want to believe, but a woman's intuition, especially after nearly 70 years of life, rarely fails. If you were me in that moment, what would you do? Rush in to confront her? Scream in the living room demanding an explanation? Not me. I spent my whole life in the emergency room, where moving too fast can kill the patient. Same here. Rushing only kills the opportunity. Don't go anywhere, because what comes next is when the curtain truly begins to lift. When, because of the baby, stops being an excuse and becomes evidence. 3 nights later, close to midnight, I woke up to a soft laugh drifting from the living room. The laugh was low, warm, slightly seductive, and completely different from Brielle's tone when she spoke in front of Terrence. It sounded real, free, not an act. I stepped down the stairs slowly, choosing the steps that creaked the least, so careful that even my breathing felt lighter. In the warm yellow light spilling from the living room into the hallway, I saw two shadows on the wall, a tall man with broad shoulders leaning back on the chair, Brielle leaning toward him, wine glass in hand. The man's voice was deep, confident, unhurried. "I told you, it's just a matter of time. Once everything is arranged, you'll have what you want." Brielle replied, her voice soft, breathy, both anxious and excited. "I'm just afraid someone will find out." "No one suspects a thing," he chuckled quietly. "Just make everything look natural. I'll take care of you, and of our baby." A cold line ran down my spine. Our baby. Those words were sharp as a blade. I didn't walk into the living room. Instead, I turned toward the kitchen and twisted the faucet open as hard as I could. The rush of water roared through the quiet house like an alarm bell. The voices in the living room faded. A few seconds later, Brielle stepped into the kitchen in her silk nightgown, smoothing her hair, still wearing a soft smile. "You're still up, Mom?" she asked lightly, as if nothing had happened. "I'm thirsty," I replied, slowing the water to a trickle. "Couldn't sleep." She smiled, eyes flicking quickly toward the living room. "I was just watching TV, those late-night cooking shows." "Have company?" I asked, although I already knew the answer perfectly well. Brielle shook her head, her smile tightening. "No." "Who would visit at this hour, Mom?" I held her gaze for a few seconds, then nodded and turned off the faucet. "Right, late-night cooking shows. Must be very entertaining." She didn't answer, just gave a strained smile and slipped out of the kitchen. I heard a soft door closing, the sound of men's leather shoes sliding across the wooden floor, and then, a few minutes later, an engine starting outside in the driveway. The next morning, Brielle behaved as if last night was nothing more than my private dream. She made smoothies, played her meditation music, talked about choosing paint colors for the nursery. Terrence kept leaving early, coming home late, repeating the same scripted line. "Brielle needs rest. Don't put pressure on her, Mom." I simply smiled, offering no argument, but I began shifting from observing to gathering evidence. I opened the smart doorbell app, the one I had installed weeks earlier, the kind with motion detection and automatic recording. The history showed a clip from 11:47 p.m. A tall man in a dark suit walked into the house without even looking up at the camera. I zoomed in. On his left wrist was a large silver watch, its face catching the porch light. I downloaded the footage and named the file, Bayshore Entry, 11:47 p.m. From that day forward, I monitored Terrence's work schedule more closely. He said he had to be on call at work constantly, even sleeping overnight there, for shift convenience. Meanwhile, Brielle was freer than ever. She received guests, personal packages, disappeared for hours without explanation. I wrote everything in my notebook. 4/4. Black Lexus, parked in front of house at 8:15 p.m. Camera recorded a man matching description from April 2nd. April 5th. Terrence says staying at work overnight. 10:32 p.m. Doorbell detects motion for 2 minutes. Image unclear. 4/6. Brielle on phone in living room. Audible line, "Don't worry, everything is progressing." I began to feel like I was living inside a play, both a witness and an unwilling audience. One afternoon, while Terrence was at work, I heard a car pull up outside. I lifted the curtain slightly. The black Lexus. The man stepped out. This time, I got a clearer look. About 40, tall, broad-shouldered, black hair with silver at the temples, a bright silver Omega watch on his wrist, navy suit tailored to perfection. He rang the doorbell, unhurried, standing straight, relaxed. A few seconds later, Brielle opened the door. Her face lit up instantly, a reflex she couldn't hide. He touched her cheek lightly before entering, a touch far too intimate to be friends or colleagues. I stood behind the kitchen door, my heart pounding, but my mind frighteningly calm. This was Colin Mercer. I had seen his name on an event card that fell out of Brielle's coat pocket days earlier. Business dinner, Mercer Financial Group. The time, the place, the way she had dressed that evening, everything lined up perfectly. I didn't step out to confront them. Not yet. I let them feel comfortable for a bit longer. A trap is most effective when the prey steps in willingly. I opened the camera app and watched live. The image was clear. Colin walked in carrying a shopping bag, set it on the table. They sat close, laughing and talking. I activated remote recording, letting the phone capture the conversation from the living room. Colin's voice. "I'm arranging everything. Once she moves out, the house will be in your name." Brielle's voice, low and tense. "I just don't want his mother to find out." Colin laughed softly. "She won't suspect a thing. Just play the exhausted wife. People will sympathize with you." Brielle sighed. "I can't take this anymore. I want it to end soon." Colin. "Patience, my love. You'll have everything." When the conversation ended, I sat in the dark replaying the recording once, then again. My hands were cold, but the voice in my mind was very clear. So all those "for the baby," for her health, for the future lines were merely a script in their plan to take what wasn't theirs. From that moment, I created a new folder on my computer and named it Bay Shore. I saved everything inside it. Photo of the black Lexus, doorbell camera video, the recorded conversation, notebook logs, screenshot of Mrs. Yvette's message. I arranged each item like building a patient's file, dates, times, involved parties. I knew one thing: people who think they're smarter than everyone else share the same weakness. They always leave traces. Brielle was too young. Colin, too arrogant. The next night, another car stopped in front of the house. This time not the Lexus, but a borrowed sedan. The engine went silent, darkness settling over the street. I lay in bed, eyes open, not needing to go downstairs. I simply reached for my phone and opened the camera app. The screen showed Brielle opening the door in her robe, eyes lighting up when she saw him. I wrote in my notebook, 4/8, Colin Mercer appears third time this week, time 11:06 p.m., Terrence absent. I stared at the screen and whispered to myself, "Keep going, Brielle. Keep believing I'm blind." Outside, the night wind brushed through the garden. The lavender swayed softly. A light laugh drifted up from the living room. Glasses clinked. I closed my eyes. By then, I no longer felt pain, only the cold clarity of someone who knows a new chapter is forming, and she alone holds the pen. I opened the Bayshore folder again and added one more line to the notes file. Note: prepare the reveal. The more they trust, the cleaner the evidence. I smiled, a small, faint smile in the dark, carrying a silent promise. They would never see what was waiting for them on the other side of this door. That Saturday morning, I came home earlier than planned after stopping by Lakeside Florist. I intended to spend the whole day rearranging the memory cabinet in the living room, the place where I used to keep our wedding photo, a few family pictures, and the crystal vase Samuel brought back from Paris in 1982. But the moment I turned into the driveway, I knew something was wrong. Nearly a dozen unfamiliar cars were packed into the yard. The gate was wide open. Music and loud chatter spilled out from inside the house whose every brick had been quiet for so many years. I got out of the car, still holding a bouquet of pink tulips. From the porch, through the living room windows, I saw people moving about, pastel pink and light blue covering everything balloons, cake, ribbons, and in the center, a large wooden sign, Baby Sprinkle, celebrating Mom-to-be Brielle. I stood still for a moment. No one had said a word to me about this party. The first feeling I had wasn't anger. It was a cold, strange emptiness opening up in my chest. I pushed the door open and stepped in. No one turned around. The music swallowed the sound of the door. A group of young women in glamorous outfits were laughing around a table covered with a white lace cloth. On the table, among cakes and gifts, a black and white ultrasound photo sat right in the center, beside a small sign, "Welcome, baby, Pierce Whitfield." I stopped short. They had already attached the name Pierce to my family's last name. I let my gaze travel around the room. Every single family photo of mine was gone. Our wedding picture, Terrence's graduation photo, Samuel's memorial portrait beside the flower vase, all of it gone. In their place, ultrasound images, congratulatory cards, handwritten phrases like "new beginnings." I could hear my own heartbeat, quiet, but each beat sharp as a pin. If you've ever walked into your own home and felt like nothing more than a guest, you know how heavy that moment is. But this was only the wrapping paper on the outside. Underneath this pastel-colored party was something else entirely, a carefully prepared takeover. Don't go anywhere, because from this point on, every congratulation would start turning into evidence. Brielle stepped out from the kitchen, rounded belly, white lace dress, a pale pink sash draped across her chest with glittering letters, "Mom-to-be." She saw me, her eyes widening for half a second, then immediately arranging themselves into a warm, well-practiced smile. "Mom, oh, I didn't think you'd be back this early. We were going to surprise you. Maybe the surprise came a little too soon." She laughed, but there was something colder than the tile beneath my feet inside that smile. I nodded slightly. "Looks like you've all been very busy." "Yes, we wanted the house to feel fresher, match the happy mood," she said. She glanced around the room, then lowered her voice just enough for me to hear. "It's wonderful to have extra space like this, isn't it, Mom?" The words "extra space" landed like a light knock on a wall, not loud, but firm. I understood very well what kind of space she was talking about. New space for the baby, and no more room for me. I didn't argue. I took out my phone and pretended to snap a few keepsake photos. In reality, I was photographing the entire room, every corner of wall, every empty patch where Samuel's picture used to hang. I moved slowly, like a proud mother documenting a party for her daughter-in-law, but my lens was recording evidence of a quiet displacement. As I passed by the kitchen, I heard a familiar, deep male voice in the far corner. I stopped, stepped back half a step, pretending to look down to check my phone. Through the slightly open door, I saw a man in a dark suit, a shiny silver watch on his wrist. Colin Mercer. He handed Brielle a white envelope. She immediately tucked it into the pink sash across her chest. I stood still. No one brings an envelope like that to a baby celebration. If it's just a normal greeting card, Brielle's voice was soft, a little shaky. "Are you sure?" Colin's voice was even, low, full of confidence. "Absolutely. After the baby is born, I'll take care of it." I hadn't misheard, "I'll take care of it." Each word was so clear I could practically hear his breathing between sentences. I tapped the button on my phone screen, opened the recording app, switched to voice memo, and slipped the phone into my pocket. I stood there for almost another full minute until the sound of laughter and clinking glasses swelled again. They walked out of the kitchen, their smiles smooth, as if nothing had just taken place. I stepped in, keeping my own gentle smile. "Excuse me, I forgot to grab more plates." Colin looked at me, paused slightly, then gave a polite nod. "Hello, Mrs. Whitfield." "I'm a friend of Terrence's." "Of course," I said, my tone level. "I've heard a lot about you." That line made his eyes freeze for exactly one beat. Brielle quickly cut in, her voice sugary. "Colin works at the same company as Terrence, Mom." "Oh, that's nice. Then you two must understand each other very well." I let my eyes flick for a split second to the edge of the envelope peeking out from under Brielle's sash, then turned away as if I hadn't noticed a thing. The party went on, noisy, bright, staged as perfectly as a theater set. I sat in a corner and watched Brielle's friends took turns complimenting the house, the cozy kitchen, the beautiful lighting, The perfect space for a young family. Someone laughed and said, "This house looks like it came right out of a magazine. The lady of the house has incredible taste." The lady of the house. No one realized that the real lady of the house was sitting quietly in the corner, smiling like a spectator at the comedy they'd just put on. I listened, missing nothing. Within the clinking of glasses and toasts to a bright future, the small details that mattered more than any words began to surface. The ring Colin slipped off and left on the table, the way Brielle looked at him through the crowd, the quick touch of hands beneath the edge of the tablecloth. Those things told the truth more clearly than any "we're just friends." I opened my phone, glanced at the recording app. Voice memo was still running. The audio was messy, laughter, chatter. And then a stretch of dialogue came through distinctly. Colin, "He trusts you now, doesn't he?" Brielle, "Completely. He doesn't suspect anything." Colin, "Good. Now we just wait for the baby to be born, and I'll handle the rest." I stopped the recording and saved the file, naming it Sprinkle Proof. Then I opened the camera and slowly filmed the room in a full circle. This time, I made sure to frame Colin's face, along with his hand resting lightly on Brielle's back. The afternoon passed in a blur. When the guests started to leave one by one, I remained standing there, smiling, shaking each hand. To them, I was the easygoing, kind, reasonable mother-in-law. One of Brielle's young friends even whispered to me, "I wish my mother-in-law was like you. It feels so peaceful here." I just smiled. "You're mistaken. This isn't peace yet." When the final door shut, the house went quiet again. Balloons were starting to sag. Cake crumbs dotted the tile. Brielle and Colin stepped outside with a few friends to see the guests off. I used that window of time, those precious few minutes, to back up all the photos and recordings onto an external drive, then emailed everything to my private account new folder name, Bayshore, Sprinkle Proofs. By the time they came back inside, I was already standing on the stairs, still holding the bouquet of pink tulips from the morning, stems drooping slightly from not having been in water. "Nice party," I said evenly. "Thank you for inviting me. It helped me see the future daughter-in-law more clearly." That night, when everyone thought the story was over, the real party began, right in the living room. The shouting exploded, no background music needed. Brielle's voice broke, shrill. "I deserve my own life! You never understood me!" Terrence's voice was heavy, ragged. "And the baby, Brielle, is it even mine?" No answer. Only the sound of a suitcase scraping across the wooden floor, zippers, doors slamming. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just a crack. Under the porch light, the black Lexus slowly rolled into the driveway. Colin Mercer stepped out, opened the trunk, lifted the luggage. A few minutes later, Brielle appeared in a long coat, not looking back even once Colin took her hand and opened the car door. The Lexus slid away, its taillights dragging a red streak across the wet road. I stood there, not feeling joy, not feeling triumphant, just the quiet aftermath of a storm you knew would come. When I turned back to the living room, Terrence had collapsed onto the sofa, head buried in his hands, eyes bloodshot. He looked hollow, like someone had scooped his heart out. I went into the kitchen, made a mug of hot peppermint tea, set it in front of him without saying a word. He looked up, eyes full of tears. "How long have you known, Mom?" "Since the moment you started avoiding my eyes," I replied. His throat tightened. "And you waited until now to say something?" "I didn't say anything at all," I answered. "I just let the truth speak." He nodded, lowering his head again. I sat beside him, without putting a hand on his shoulder, without rushing to comfort him. Sometimes pain needs to breathe. It doesn't need to be smothered with, "Everything will be okay." The clock ticked. The wind nudged the window frame. In the house that had been full of loud music and fake laughter, there was finally a real quiet, the kind that only comes after the masks are torn off. Terrence spoke softly, voice shredded. "I've been blind for so long. You tried to warn me and I wouldn't listen." I shook my head. "No, Terrence, I never tried to warn you. I waited for you to see it yourself." He let out a thin, bitter laugh. "Well, I see it now. And what am I supposed to do with that?" "You don't have to decide tonight," I said slowly. "What matters is that for the first time, you know I wasn't wrong." He nodded, saying nothing more. I poured more tea and slid the mug a little closer to him. The steam rose, curling into the warm light like a thin mist between mother and son. We sat there for a long time, both of us silent. The house was peaceful, the kind of peace only people who have just lost something important can recognize. Near midnight, I stood up and quietly locked the front door. The click of the lock was small but clear, the sound of an old chapter closing. In the living room, Terrence was still staring into his cup of tea. He was no longer the man lost in the illusion Brielle had built for him. In the yellow light, I saw my son, hurt, fragile, but real. I went back and sat down beside him, not preaching, not talking about forgiveness or lessons. I simply let my hand rest close to his, close enough for him to know his mother was still there if he needed her. In the silence, with the warmth of tea and the wind on the porch, the bond between mother and child, once severed by lies, began slowly knitting itself back together, bit by bit, with the help of nothing but the truth. And to me, that was the only victory that mattered that entire day. The next morning, early sunlight poured through the living room windows. The light was soft but sharp, catching each dust mote floating in the air, the dust of long days of silence, of fake words, of wounds that had been hidden away for far too long. I poured myself a cup of coffee, stood in the middle of the room, and looked around the house. Strange, quiet in a completely different way. No more high heels clicking across the wooden floor. No more heavy perfume clouding the house every morning. No more lectures about how the baby needs quiet. Only me, Terrence, and the truth. I started the morning by wiping down every family photo frame. The picture of the three of us at Lake Michigan when Terrence was 10, I was in a red sweater, Samuel's arm around our son's shoulders, and Terrence smiling big, clutching a fishing rod longer than he was tall. I blew the dust off the corners of the frame and hung it back in its old place above the fireplace. Right next to it, I rehung Samuel's portrait, the one Brielle had taken down to make the room brighter. I stepped back and looked at my husband's steady smile behind the glass. The morning sun caught his face, drawing a thin golden halo around it. "Good morning, Samuel," I whispered. "Everything is going back where it belongs." The next room, the one Brielle had baptized as the baby's room, was now utterly still. Faded scraps of pale pink fabric, ribbons, and the baby on the way sign lay scattered on a chair like the remnants of a fake dream. I took down the plastic mobile with the slowly spinning stars and placed it in a box. Then I took apart the white crib, wiped each wooden bar clean, and stacked it neatly away. In its place, I brought in a small guest bed, spread fresh white sheets, and set a purple lavender sprig in a vase on the bedside table. The room was no longer a symbol of a takeover. It was once again what it was meant to be, a quiet space for anyone who walked into this house with good intentions. By noon, I started gathering Brielle's decorations. Gold-plated frames, glass vases, those embroidered home sweet home pillows she'd brought over like little flags staking a claim. I wrapped everything carefully, taped the boxes shut, and stacked them in a corner. On each lid, I wrote slowly, by hand, "Property of Brielle Whitfield, kept for 30 days. No rage, no resentment, just doing exactly what Attorney Langford had advised. Re-establish the boundaries. Clear, calm, legal." Terrence walked in just as I was sealing the last box. At first, he just stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. Then, as if making a small but important decision, he came closer and held the edge of the box so I could press the tape down firmly. After that, he quietly took out his toolbox and started tightening door hinges, replacing burned-out light bulbs, adjusting the loose stair railing that had been wobbly for months. I watched without interrupting. The son I thought had drifted away from me under layers of poisoned sweetness was coming back, not with promises, not with tears, but with small, solid actions, tightening a screw, changing a bulb, reinforcing a handrail. When Terrence climbed the ladder to change the overhead light in the dining room, the new light flicked on, spilling down across the table. He glanced down, his eyes meeting mine. A faint smile flickered across his face, tired but calmer than before. "Mom," he said softly, "the house looks brighter." I replied, "Because the darkness isn't here anymore, son." If you've listened this far, I think you can feel it too. There are moments in life when you don't need a screaming match to change direction. Sometimes it's just a quiet morning, a few family photos going back where they belong, a new light turning on, and the balance of power in a house shifts without anyone announcing it. Don't leave yet, because what Viola is about to do next is the move Brielle and Colin never saw coming. That afternoon, we sat in the living room going over the documents attorney Howard Langford had sent. I laid the stack of papers on the table and said clearly, "No more contacting Brielle. Let the lawyers handle it. We wait out the 30 days. Terrence nodded, his shoulders dropping as if a weight had been lifted. "I don't want to talk to her anymore anyway. At least now I know who's really on my side." No more words were needed. Between mother and son, there was now a quiet agreement, something I hadn't felt in years. By the end of the day, I was cleaning the kitchen. When I opened one of the cabinets, I saw the cobalt blue ceramic set, the one Brielle had said was temporarily stored in the basement so it wouldn't look so old-fashioned. I took each piece out and washed it in warm water, dried it, then put it back in its old spot in the cupboard, perfectly aligned in a straight row. As my fingertips touched the cool glaze, I realized this house had never really been lost. It had just been covered in dust by other people's lies. I turned on the oven and pulled out the flour to make cinnamon waffles. The smell of cinnamon warmed the kitchen, seeped into the hallway, and wrapped itself around the house, a kind of memory both deep and gentle. It had been a long time since this house smelled like something made with love. Back then, whenever I baked, Samuel would throw open the window facing the lake and laugh. A house is truly alive when it smells like something made with love. I did exactly that. I opened the big window out to Clear Lake. Cool air rushed in, carrying mist and the faint scent of water. Afternoon light danced on the lake, scattering shimmering reflections across the kitchen walls. No priest, no ritual needed. That afternoon felt like a simple cleansing ceremony. Wind, light, and a heart no longer afraid. Terrence stood in the doorway, his hands still marked with streaks of white paint. He looked around and said quietly, "Mom, the house looks like it used to." I wiped my hands on my apron and smiled. "No, son, the house looks exactly the way it's supposed to." He nodded, his eyes resting on the small candle I'd just lit on the dining table. We both thought of Samuel, the man who had laid the first bricks of this house and used to joke, "Every storm just washes the porch clean." When night fully fell, I sat at the little table by the window, took out pen and paper, and wrote a handwritten letter to Mrs. Yvette Coleman. "Dear Mrs. Yvette, I want to thank you, not only for what you told me that day, but for your honesty. You have no idea how much it helped me. In life, there are people who pass us only for a brief moment, yet leave a streak of light like a lamp in the night. I hope that one day you'll come over for tea and hear the end of this story when everything has finally gone quiet. With sincere gratitude, Viola Randall." I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and set it neatly on the small table under the window. When night settled in completely, I went back to the living room. A small lamp cast warm light, reflecting off the glass of the family photos that had returned to their rightful places. Outside, the lake was flat and still, like a mirror. Inside, I no longer felt chaos, only a deep, heavy peace, the kind only those who have walked through a great storm can recognize. I spoke softly, not sure whether to Samuel or to myself. The house has been given back to the right person, and so has my heart. On the morning of the 30th day, I woke up before the sun. Dawn spread a layer of honey-colored light over the lake, the water rippling gently as if breathing steadily. On the kitchen table was an email from Attorney Langford, short, decisive, no frills. Mrs. Whitfield, the 30-day period has ended. There has been no claim, no response from Brielle or any representative of hers. The file is officially closed. I read every word slowly, as if afraid my eyes were playing tricks on me. Once, twice, a third time. There were no hidden lines, no fine print. A long chapter filled with smoke and fire, tears, and silent tug-of-war had truly come to an end. No courtroom, no fiery confrontation, no tearful final conversation like in some TV drama. Just absolute silence from Brielle's side. And that very silence was the clearest answer of all. She knew she had lost, and she knew there was no place for her to come back to. Here. I took a deep breath, sipped my coffee, and felt my heartbeat, for the first time in months, no longer racing against fear. By noon, Terence came home. He stood in the doorway, an envelope in hand, his face relieved but tinged with shame. "Langford sent me a copy too," he said, lifting the envelope slightly. "It's really over, Mom." I nodded. "The legal part is over. What about your part?" Terence looked up. In his eyes now there was no defensiveness, no doubt, no urge to find excuses for anyone. Only raw remorse remained. He stepped closer and set the envelope down on the table like laying down a confession. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice thick, "for letting an outsider make me doubt my own mother, for staying silent when you needed me the most." I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. "You don't have to apologize for being deceived, Terence. Everyone gets lost in the dark sometimes, until the light comes back." He exhaled, long but lighter. "I've started seeing a therapist, Mom. Not to forget, but to learn how not to repeat this." He swallowed hard. "I want you to trust me again." I smiled. "I don't need promises. I just need you to live straight and live clear. That's enough." He nodded slightly. For the first time in many months, I saw in Terence's eyes not someone else's reflection, but his own. If you're still listening at this point, you've probably felt it too. On an ordinary day, in the kitchen light and the smell of coffee, you realize that the people you love most aren't always on the right side, but they aren't always your enemies either. Sometimes they're just people who lost their way, the same way you once did, with the only difference that this time, you're the one holding the lantern. Don't leave the story yet, because what happens to Colin and Brielle next will show you. Some prices, eventually, everyone has to pay. 2 days later, the local paper ran the story, page 3, center column. Not a screaming headline, but big enough that no one would miss it. Local businessman Colin Mercer, under investigation for financial fraud, investment scam. Accounts frozen, the company under full investigation. Investors lining up to file lawsuits. The article didn't mention Brielle. There was only one vague, icy line. A young woman previously seen with Mercer in the Clear Lake area is currently unaccounted for. I folded the paper. No joy, no gloating, no serves them right satisfaction. Just the feeling of a circle closing. You reap what you sow. Some pits people dig for others. In the end, fit them perfectly. That afternoon, I went down to the basement. The boxes labeled property of Brielle Whitfield, kept for 30 days, sat quietly in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. I took a marker, stood still for 1 beat, then calmly crossed out the old line. Underneath the fresh black ink, I wrote, "Ownerless belongings, not spiteful, not venomous, just a simple truth in black and white." I locked the basement door and installed a new lock. The click rang out neat and clean, the sound of the past being sealed away, with no chance of climbing back up the stairs to haunt the house ever again. In the weeks that followed, the house by Clear Lake began to move to a new rhythm. I opened the door to women who needed a place to stay, for storms, for escaping abusive husbands, for walking away from toxic families, for stepping back from their own old decisions. I set a few simple rules. Each person could stay for a maximum of 30 days. Respect the shared space. Don't dump your personal storm on someone else. And if possible, during the last week, contribute 1 shared dinner. I called it the dinner fund, not rent, but a kind of thank you, paid in food and stories and laughter. One Friday night, there were 5 of us at the table. Me, Terrence, Denise Harrow, who'd stayed here once and come back to visit, Shanice Porter and her 2-year-old son, Micah, and a young woman named Renee Foxworth, fresh out of a women's support center a few days earlier. The kitchen was thick with the smell of roast chicken, butter and garlic, and freshly melted cheese. The clink of cutlery, Micah's bubbly giggles, Shanice's story about working late shifts only to get stiffed by a customer. All of it blended into one shared sound, the sound of people who had broken, learning how to stand again. Terrence lifted his glass of lemonade, looked around the table, then looked at me. In his eyes was something unfamiliar, a mix of pride, shame, and gratitude. "If someone had told me," he said with a small laugh, "that one day you'd turn this house into a shelter for people, I wouldn't have believed it. I thought it was just our home." I answered, my voice soft but firm. "It's still our home, son. It's just that now it's big enough for other people to breathe in, too." He shook his head and laughed out loud for the first time in a long while. "You didn't just keep the house. You turned it into a place that saves people." I shook my head. "Not saving. I just opened the door. Whether they save themselves, that's up to each of them." That night, when everyone had gone to their rooms, I sat alone in the living room. On the wall, the family photos hung straight and true, glowing softly in the warm lamplight. Samuel's face in his frame looked like he was smiling. Not his gentle everyday smile, but that knowing kind of smile. "Told you so." Right beneath it was the new lock, small, simple, but it carried more meaning than any stack of legal documents, no matter how thick I had taken my house back, but not through hatred, not through some loud, explosive revenge. I took it back with light, with patience, and with a stubborn belief that the truth, no matter how buried, will always find its way home. I opened my notebook, the journal that had followed me through this entire storm, and wrote the final line of that journey. I was not driven out of my own home. I was the one who drove the darkness out of it. I closed the notebook. The sound of the pages touching the cover was soft, like a period being placed exactly where it belonged. That night, I went out to the porch and sat facing Clear Lake. Cool wind, rippling water, moonlight scattered silver over the surface as if someone were gently sprinkling light. From where I sat, looking back at my house, the house that had been occupied, lied to, strangled, now glowed warm yellow through the windows. Not harsh, but warm and steady. Terrence came out and draped a sweater over my shoulders. "Mom," he said, eyes still on the lake, "I think people need to hear this story." I smiled, not rushing to answer. "Those who need it will hear it, son. Those who aren't ready yet, when they're brave enough to open the door to their own house, they'll understand." The wind moved through the willows, leaves rustling like someone whispering. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet. No more strange footsteps in the night. No more manipulative voices. No more fear of being pushed out of my own life. Only the light of a true home, a place where everyone is allowed to breathe, allowed to make mistakes, allowed to begin again. I tilted my head back and looked up at the sky above Clear Lake, where the stars still flickered patiently. They reminded me of something simple. Darkness never wins forever. I smiled, a peaceful smile, as light as the breeze gliding over the lake. If you've walked with me all the way to the final page of this story, thank you, truly. If there has ever been a moment when, in your own home, you felt like an extra, if someone ever tried to push you out of the place that's yours, or tried to make you believe you were a burden, tell me in the comments. I read every line, not out of curiosity, but because every real story is a small lantern in the night, letting those who come after know they're not the only one. Where are you listening to this story from? Clear Lake, Houston, Saigon, Hanoi, Da Nang, or somewhere far away on the other side of the ocean? Leave the name of the city or country where you live, so this little house on this channel can feel just a bit closer to you. And if this story touched you, if you'd like to keep sitting with me on the porch, listening to more journeys from darkness into light, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. That way, every time I open the door to tell a new story, you'll always have a seat in the front row. Thank you for helping the light in this house never go out.